Hi everyone, Master P here from the Language of Composition 3rd edition. We're here for another close reading video, and today we're going to take a look at an excerpt from On the Duty of Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. So when we are closely reading, we are actively reading, and that means we are physically engaging with a text, that we are annotating and writing and really trying to reveal the layers of meaning within a text. And we're also looking to understand the rhetoric, we're looking to understand the style and the strategies a writer has used to establish a position, create an argument, so forth. So the tools that we need a copy of the Language of Composition 3rd edition. We need our close reading passage handouts. We are always, I think, helped by color, and so different colors of highlighters are useful. Certainly something to write with either a pen or a pencil. So we always start by looking at some of those elements of the whole and considering the rhetorical situation. So we're thinking about how a particular text is informed by the speaker, right, who wrote the text, and not just by name, but also considering their persona. From what perspective are they writing? As a leader, as a father, as a mother, as a person who's been through this experience, as an outside observer, right? We're thinking about the subjects involved in the text and also for whom the text was written. Who is the intended audience, whether that's a very specific group of people or a specific group of people, but also a larger group of people. So that sort of immediate audience and that remote audience. All of this is shaped, of course, by the context, those historical factors, the contemporary issues, and of course that occasion, that spark for why the text was written in that moment, at that time, for that audience on the subject. Okay, so understanding the rhetorical situation for this piece. Henry David Thoreau is the speaker. He was a great thinker and writer. He was part of that transcendentalist movement, and kind of looks a little sad in that picture. I'm not gonna lie. He wasn't always that sad, but he does look very serious and sad in that picture. Really has the beard thing going though. So this particular piece was actually originally delivered as a lecture, and it was delivered in 1848 to the Concord Lyceum. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and I certainly was before I looked this up, Lyceum was a public forum that promoted thoughtful conversation and education about the intellectual and ethical questions of 19th century society. And honestly, I think we should bring some of that back. I feel like we should have lyceums today where we have thoughtful conversations about issues going on today. So just an idea. He wrote this speech or this lecture in response to being arrested and jailed for not paying his poll tax, which he didn't pay because he was making a point. He was against slavery and was not happy with how the Massachusetts government was handling issues of abolition, this pre-Civil War. And so as a way to show his disfavor with what his government was doing, he said, I'm not going to pay that poll tax, which landed him in jail. But then someone paid the tax, and so he was released from jail, and that's what prompted this lecture. So his audience would have been, it was an open public forum, and we can imagine that the people who would attend this kind of event would be people interested in discussion and debate, probably people who weren't necessarily educated, maybe not even literate, but who could attend and listen and still be engaged in the issues. So some of those issues he discusses or raises in this speech: acting on one's conscience, resistance to government, civil duties, moral duties, and abolition of slavery. All right, so first we want to begin by reading for understanding. Thoreau's writing is very challenging. it's older. It was written a long time ago, or relatively a long time ago. And so the language is difficult, and a lot of his writing is very philosophical. So you have to take your time with it, and that's okay. This is the kind of reading where you really do have to slow down and dig into it, but it's so, so rich in meaning, and it's so um, well written and beautiful that it's worth the extra time and effort to really get into this piece. So I'm going to give you a moment to really dig into this and read it, make sure you understand it before we look at some of those other features. We want to think about and consider those overall features. So we're thinking about purpose, mood, tone, position, and the S in parentheses is there because for most of these, there isn't just one answer, right? There's more than one answer. The tone shifts, the mood shifts. Thoreau has multiple positions on these issues. So considering all of that, and we need to remember to look at these elements first because analysis is all about breaking down a text, looking at how the individual pieces function together to create this whole, these overall features. So take a moment and talk about this with your classmates, write it down, talk about it with your teachers. All right. So hopefully you've had a chance to discuss this. Let me share with you what I wrote down, which you could have something different or related. That's okay. My answers are not always the final answers. So I put down for purpose that Thoreau is trying to convince people to take action according to their conscience. I said that his mood is indignant and frustrated, that his tone toward the government is highly skeptical and critical, and that his position is that man must act according to one's conscience and that we shouldn't wait for others. We shouldn't wait for the majority. We shouldn't wait for the government to do something, that we as individuals need to act immediately upon how we feel. So that's what I made of those larger pieces. So we've read for understanding. Hopefully we've annotated for understanding. If not, you could go back and do that. We want to annotate for style. We want to annotate for argument. Then we can corral all of our various markings on the paper using a graphic organizer. And then we can turn that information into an analytical writing, whether it be sentences, paragraphs, an entire essay, right? Okay, so I'm going to pause this for 1 minute while I switch to that graphic organizer. All right, so we're back. And I'm actually glad that I paused it because I almost forgot to show you my annotation process. So let's actually switch to that before we get to the graphic organizer. So I'm going to switch to my document on the computer, but I also have my hard copy here where I've made my notes. So in this passage, which is somewhat near the beginning of the excerpt of on the duty of civil disobedience, we see that Thoreau uses this technique throughout the entire piece where he is asking questions, right? There are these rhetorical questions here. And because of his audience, because of the occasion, he was delivering this as a lecture. It's a public forum. It's meant to initiate discussion. It's meant to get people to think. And it makes sense, therefore, that he would pose so many rhetorical questions because he really is trying to get his audience to think. And they are, in fact, attending these lectures to think. So those rhetorical questions really speak to the occasion and the audience. So he asked this rhetorical question, how can a man be satisfied to entertain an opinion merely and enjoy it? Followed by another rhetorical question, is there any enjoyment in it if his opinion is that he is aggrieved? And aggrieved meaning resentful at being treated unfairly, right? And then he provides this example. It's sort of a hypothetical example, but a realistic example of being cheated out of some money, right? And he uses this example as a way to set up his point that action from principle, the perception and the performance of right changes things and relations. And I like his alliterative effect of principle, perception, performance. That repeated P sound at the beginning gives that powerful consonant sound, right? That correlates with the powerful idea that action from principle changes things and relations. That's a very powerful idea, which is echoed in the powerful repetition of that P sound. It is essentially revolutionary, right? So looking at what it means, and with these older texts, it's important to be able to trace the pronoun and the antecedent, and going back to what is he referring to when he says it. This idea of action from principle is revolutionary, right? It not only divides, so action from principle not only divides states and churches, it divides families, it divides the individual. So we have this list of consequences, divisive consequences, right? Separating the diabolical in him from the divine. So we've got some antithesis here. There's a real separation. It's very clear to Thoreau, and that's part of his point. It's clear. You either act according to your conscience or you don't. You're either doing the right thing or you're not. You're complicit, right? Unjust laws exist, right? Short, simple, here it is. It's a fact. It's clear. He's making this. Shall we be content to obey them? And notice, again, appealing to his audience, that use of we, not pointing the finger. He's not saying, shall you be content to avoid them? But we, as in humankind, people, including himself. And so here we have, again, some antithesis here. Shall we endeavor to amend them? And that parallelism, there's a clear divide, right, wrong, right? And obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once? So are we just going to follow along and obey, or are we going to really resist and go beyond the bounds of these unjust laws, right? Okay, let's see. Let's skip to the next page. You could see, again, so many of these rhetorical questions because he wants the people in this audience to think. And then he uses these allusions, considering his audience at the time would have been well-read in the Bible, probably church-going folk. And so he uses these biblical allusions to connect with his audience as well. And also in this section, he personifies the government as though it is one person or one person, and criticizes the government's actions. So we have, one would think that a deliberate and practical denial of its authority was the only offense never contemplated by government, right? So again, one would think there's this emphasis throughout on thought and being thoughtful and questioning what is happening around you, and sort of resisting just accepting what's going on. We have another example. So here he's making a point, and then he's following it by this example. Okay. Down here we get to this metaphor. If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go, let it go. So repetition emphasizing the idea of letting something go. Calling out that sometimes there is necessary friction. Certainly the machine will wear out. Something will happen, right? He's not saying that everybody should resist everything all the time. Perchance it will run smooth. So extending that metaphor. If the injustice has a spring or pulley or rope or a crank. So this list of ways to change the government, right? Then perhaps you may consider, this is a very gentle request at this point, perhaps may consider gently trying to persuade his audience whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil, right? Again, this use of the word evil we see a couple of times, going back to the sense of morality involved in this issue. Then I say, break the law. Very simple, very clear, very direct. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. And this is the quotation that we're going to analyze or discuss in just a minute with the graphic organizer. So we'll come back to that. What I have to do, and here he comes back to, up here he says, then I say what I have to do. So there is certainly this element of ethos, speaking as an authority, speaking as someone who is, his actions demonstrate his commitment to his words, right? And people at this lecture, of course, would have known that he was just arrested and jailed, that he's walking the walk, right? He's not just talking the talk, he's walking the walk. And so he has that authority, but he's, of course, referring to, he's still going to refer to what he has done in order to make this argument. Right, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Okay. All right, let's look at the last part of this, and let me flip here. The sentence here, so he says before this, he says, as for adopting the ways which the state has provided for remedying the evil, I know not of such ways. They take too much time, right? Government takes too much time. Even back then, he felt the government took too much time. We might call that red tape or bureaucracy. He says that a man's life will be gone. I have other affairs to attend to. I saw that as a little bit of sarcasm. Of course he does. Everybody does, right? So it's understatement, but making his point that we can't just sit around and wait. And there is some, referring to good place to live in, be it good or bad. So putting things again in these moral, there are no shades of gray here. It's just two categories, good or bad. You can't do everything, but it's necessary. You should do something. Let's see. Again, a question, right? Followed by a very simple answer. But in this case, the state has provided no way. Its very constitution is the evil. So moralistic terms. This may seem to be harsh and stubborn and unconciliatory. So listing, it's not harsh, stubborn, and it's harsh and stubborn. So using that word and, the conjunction, the technique polysyndeton, to really point out, you might think it's this and this and this, but here's our shift, it is to treat with the utmost kindness and consideration the only spirit that can appreciate or deserves it. So is all the changes for the better, like birth and death, which convulse the body. So again, sort of using this metaphor as, well, maybe not even the government, but just sort of America in general, that the change must happen, and it's for the better. Birth and death are for the better, even though convulse implies that there's a violent change. And in some ways, this moment, I think, anticipates the Civil War, right? That Thoreau implies, because the change must convulse, but is for the better, it implies that there will need to be a violent change, that you have to use your life to be a counter friction, and that can cause physical harm, but you still must act according to your conscience. So, all right, so let's go back then. There's a lot that you could get into, certainly, but let's just look at this one particular quote. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. So my way of paraphrasing that is that he's saying you use your own influence to affect the functioning of government, or the function of government. I noticed that it's an imperative sentence, that he uses the word your to directly address the reader. and then the sentence is part of a metaphor, an extended metaphor, the government as a machine. So I said that the effector function is that the sentence is forceful and descriptive, which compels people to see their own actions as important. So how did I put all this into sentence format? I said Thoreau's writing calls his audience to action. He commands, let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. By using the word your, he compels the reader to pay attention through this direct address. He gives weight and value to your life by equating it to a force that physically acts against the metaphorical machine of government and unjust policy. Okay. So there's an example. Again, there's so much here. You can take so many different parts of this text to get into and write this rhetorical analysis. And hopefully you can use these strategies when confronted with a prompt such as this. In a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies employed by Thoreau to establish his attitude toward the government. That's just one prompt you could have with this piece. There are so many other ways to look at this analysis. But it's a lot of hard work, and we know that you can do it. And as always, the other authors and I want to thank you for your time and your hard work. And we say, fare thee well, young scholars.